few more numbers here. In terms of what the U.S. landscape looks like, because of the industrial animal system, because of the vast increases in the last 50 years in the amount of meat and dairy that's produced in this country, we've effectively created a monoculture in terms of our agriculture. Half of U.S. farm acres are planted in soy and corn. Those are used largely for animal feed, also for things like processed foods. And those of you who know the work of Michael Pollan will be quite familiar with his analysis of the uses of corn and high fructose corn syrup and as a filler in many, many foods that people eat on a daily basis. There are many problems with the monoculture. One is you can even just hear it in the word. It's the opposite of something like biodiversity. It's the opposite of a vibrant landscape with different species of plants and animals. Monocultures also are not good carbon sinks. And by carbon sink, it's an area that would not only capture carbon from the atmosphere, but hold carbon that has been there for thousands, if not millions of years. But because the land used for soy and corn is so intensively farmed, churned up, pesticides, chemical fertilizers used, there's very tiny capacity to store carbon. So that again has another negative climate impact. In terms of the way the land is managed, to produce the soy and corn, enormous amounts of pesticides, enormous amounts of synthetic fertilizer, and to produce that fertilizer also requires enormous amounts of fossil fuels. So we have yet again another loop in terms of climate impact. In addition to the greenhouse gases emitted to produce these chemical inputs, there are, as Marisa said, a lot of negative effects of runoff from soy and corn crops in terms of nutrient runoff, overloading if manure is put onto a field, overloading of pesticides that flows into waterways, leads to things called dead zones, where there's basically no marine life. There's a large one in the Gulf of Mexico, there's some in the Chesapeake Bay, or what's known as impairment. It's a funny technical term, but meaning that a waterway no longer has the vitality, can't be a home for as many species, can't be used by people in the same way it would have been because its ecological functions have been impaired. And then just a quick data point. I found this myself quite astonishing, that in the United States this year, 86 million acres are planted with corn, 4.35 million acres for all the vegetables planted in the United States, meaning in a tiny proportion, just reinforcing the monoculture that our agriculture has become. And of those 4.35 million acres, only 130,000 acres of broccoli. Again, I think in New York City, probably hard to envision what exactly 130,000 acres is, but it's a tiny, tiny patch on 86 million acres. And in terms of overall agricultural land, only 1.5 of American acres are planted in vegetables. And we all know we need to eat more vegetables. A couple points on fossil fuels and food. So the industrial agriculture system, whether livestock or even for non-livestock products, using vegetable products, in this intensification where things are large, where chemical fertilizers are required, it's very, very thirsty for fossil fuels, for production of chemical fertilizers, to run these large operations where food is processed, where animals are housed and then slaughtered, to transport food over long distances. And there's a study that suggests that the average American food, so most things that we eat on average, if you don't buy at a commercial farmer's market, have traveled 2,500 miles to get from the producer to where you purchased that. So that's almost across the country. The food system in the U.S. uses approximately 18% of the U.S. total energy supply. Given the U.S. total energy supply is heavily reliant on oil, gas, coal, there's a lot of fossil fuel intensity and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food industry as well. And then looking at a calculation called fossil fuel intensity. So again, the inputs of fossil fuels to produce an output in terms of food. The average in the United States for the foods that we would eat is about 3 to 1. So 3 times the energy for 1 unit of output in terms of food. But for industrially produced meat, that can be up to 35 to 1. So more than 10 times as much fossil fuel intensity, fossil fuel input, with again, a significant climate impact. Okay, as Marisa also mentioned, our system of producing and consuming food is going global. The Western diet is part and parcel of the process of globalization, and along with that go these intensive systems, feedlots, factory farms, to produce ever-increasing numbers of animals. Why is this happening? Many reasons. One is that in the US and Europe, also Australia, there's a demand among agribusiness for new markets. In many ways, the industrialized world is saturated. If we're eating 200 pounds of meat a year, how much more can we actually eat? So they're looking for new markets. Government trade policies support them in that, in finding new places to launch operations. US agribusiness giants like Smithfield, Tyson have joint ventures now in countries like India, in countries like China, with large populations and diets that traditionally have not been heavy in meat or dairy. Worldwide, currently, about 56 billion farmed animals are consumed each year. So that's almost 10 for each person on the planet. And the average person eats about 70 pounds of meat a year. So again, a small fraction of what the US is eating on average per person, but that number is rising. As it does, and as we discuss climate and the climate crisis more generally, we see increasing signs of stress. 70% of agricultural land around the world is now used to produce meat and dairy, or the crops that are essential to feed the animals raised for food. Land degradation, desertification, the drying out of land is increasing in many parts of the world, in East Africa, in China, in parts of India, even in parts of Latin America that have been extremely fertile and really wet in terms of rainfall. The climate is changing. Just to take one example, in Brazil, the deforestation of the Amazon and the destruction of the savanna, called the Cerrado there, is driven primarily by cattle. So clearing the forest to bring cattle in. And when the cattle have exhausted the land, soy farmers come after that, large-scale industrial soy. And that soy is almost entirely used to feed animals, both in Brazil or exported to support the livestock industry more globally. We see in the news increasing evidence of droughts that once were a very rare occurrence becoming more common. East Africa right now is in the midst of a very severe drought. People are dying, livestock are dying, the economies are being challenged. This picture was actually taken in Kenya. Water scarcity is growing, both as populations increase, as the intensity with which we use resources increases. And unfortunately, the livestock industry is also the largest global water polluter. So even as supplies of water are declining, levels of pollution are very intense. Food security is the concept of people having enough food to eat. That's increasingly being challenged. There's still widespread poverty in the world, that 1 billion people are considered to be hungry, to not have enough food to eat on a daily basis. And demand for grain for livestock, as well as some for biofuels, but livestock is a part of this, is driving up prices of staple foods, things like rice, things like wheat, putting those out of reach of people in poor countries, poor people in wealthier countries. So the risk of rising hunger is absolutely increasing at the same time as we have the global climate unsettled and leading to much more uncertainty in terms